Welcome to the fifth session of the Tanakh and the Halakhic mindset as part of our Semicha program. We are looking at Parashat Mishpatim, Sefer, the book of Shemot, chapter 21, verse 15. Umakeh aviv ve'imo mot yumat. He who hates his father and mother shall be put to death. Next, ve'gonev ishum charov v'nimtza beyado mot yumat. He who steals or kidnaps a person and sells him, v'nimtza beyado mot yumat, and it is proven that he is guilty, he'll be put to death. Mekalel aviv ve'imo mot yumat. He who curses his father and mother will be put to death. The relations between those three is not clear. It's something definitely that has to be studied with more depth. We understand that one who turns against his father and mother was held as contempt at the time, so there might be a possibility that the person would really not be put to death, but rather that this is a deterrent and a threat. And the vegonev ishum charo, kidnapping and selling a person, might allude to the story of the brothers stealing Yosef. So the Torah puts together a reference to the biblical narrative of Bereshit, where the kidnapping of Yosef brought, we could say, that the emotional or spiritual death of Yaakov. In that spirit, one might say, even though I admit that this is a very, those three psukim are very difficult, might say that those halachot are more used as a deterrent to threaten people not to be engaged in such type of activity. But that is a matter, as I said, for further discussion. Then we read that if two people fight and one of them wounded or hurt another person, he'll have to be responsible for his expenses. This goes along the general line of the Torah, and specifically Parashat Mishpatim, and that is the idea of responsibility, which later on the rabbi will phrase in the words Adam mu'ad le'olam. Humans are forever responsible for their actions. And then the next halakha switches back to the laws of slavery. V'cheikeish ta'avdo o et amato bashevet umet tachat yado nakom yinakem. Ach im yom o yomim ya'amod lo yukam ki chaspohu. If a master caused the death of his servant, of his slave or his maidservant, he will be punished. Nakom yinakem literally means that he will be put to death. And that is a stark contradiction to the laws of slavery in the ancient world, and even in the modern world. In modern American history, slave owners would not really be held responsible for physical damage or death of their slaves. But the Torah says, "Nakom yinakem," he will be punished according to what he did. The next halakha in this parasha speaks about men who, while fighting, hit a pregnant woman, and she delivered her children. So the Torah says, "Velo yason," if there was no physical damage or loss of life, still they have to be punished, either because it's considered public embarrassment or because they put the woman's life in danger. And in this case, the husband is the one who sets the amount of the fine. But if there will be a disaster, meaning there will be a loss of life or physical damage, the Torah says that one will have to pay life for life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, etc. Today, it is an accepted truth, an axiom in the yeshiva world, in the Orthodox world, that an eye for an eye is not to be taken literally, and it means financial retribution. In the words of the Gemara, in the Midrash Halakha, ayin tachat ayin mamon. But upon analyzing the sources, both in Midrash Halakha and in the Talmud Masechet Bava Kama, one can see that it was not as clear. It's definitely not clear from the text that it means monetary payment, and could be understood theoretically, at least according to the pshat of the pasuk, that one will be damaged the same way that he damaged others. Again, we might argue that this only served as a deterrent and was not practiced in reality. The following halakha, think we mentioned this earlier when we spoke about the general concept of slavery. The Torah says that if a master causes physical damage to his slave or maidservant, he has to set them free. Again, this is something that is in stark contradiction to the laws of slavery of other cultures, and even in the history of slave ownership in America. The Torah then goes to speak about the damages caused by one's property, such as animals, an ox that gored and killed a person. The pshat of the Torah again is ashor yisakel v'gam be'alav yumat. If the ox was an habitual offender, the ox should be put to death, and so should be the owner. The rabbinical law mitigated this halakha to look at what is the exactly responsibility of the owner, but we have to have in mind also that rabbinical literature tried to diminish the frequency of executions, maybe because of fear or a response to the Roman culture, to the Roman cruelty, where thousands of people would be executed on a regular basis, and the rabbis were afraid that this mentality would affect also Jewish courts. But it would make sense also that the rabbis who were aware of the original intention of the Torah and received sort of a secret code telling them how to interpret the laws of the Torah, understood that most of the halachot that are written in the Torah and include the death penalty are understood more as a deterrent, and therefore the rabbis later on created a very elaborate system of warning and admonitions and validation of testimony, etc., just to make sure that people are not executed, and then, of course, will be in a irreversible situation once injustice is done. However, the Torah seems to be a little more harsh in trying to regulate the society and instill the idea that a person is responsible for his actions and the actions of his property, in this case, animals. In the same vein, step back 1 second, one might raise the question. It seems from the pasuk that if the ox gored a slave or a maidservant, the punishment of the owner is lesser. But in closer examination, this is what the Torah says. There are 3 sets of halachot. If the ox gored someone to death, the owner of the ox would be put to death. If the ox gored a man or a woman, free man or woman, then the owner has to pay a fine and the ox will be put to death. If the ox gored a slave or a maidservant, but there were no fatalities, in that case the fine will be paid to the master and the ox will be put to death, and not as some people think that it means that this law applies even when the slave or the maidservant were gored to death. This is a law that predates later legislation and probably hundreds of, if not thousands of years, and that is that one is responsible for his actions in the public property, and if he left a hazard in the public property or dug a hole in public property, he is responsible for all the damages that were created because of that obstacle. Later on, the Torah goes on to describe in detail the laws of damages of property. If one sets fire and it spreads to another field, if one lets his animals graze freely and they go into another field, if a burglar breaks into a house, is one allowed to kill him or defend himself? And the laws of Shomrim, the guardians, if one is given an object to guard either for free or for a payment. Now, all these halachot are discussed with great detail in the Talmud, especially in the Masechet Bava Kama. But we have to have in mind that when we come to the issues of responsibility, the law of the country should be taken into account, because a lot of what the Torah says here is said in a vacuum, meaning where there is no other law or agreement, especially when we talk about the laws of responsibility, liability, and the reciprocity between a guardian and the one who gave him an object to guard, is determined based on what is the official custom or the official practice of that country. Meaning, I'll give an example that has to do with insurance today. If a person if a man gave to his friend, it's a real case. A man asked his friend to keep some of his merchandise in his warehouse. The warehouse was insured, but the merchandise of the friend was not insured, since the insurance only covered the merchandise that belonged to the owner of the warehouse. The warehouse with all the merchandise were damaged by fire, and now the owner of the warehouse wanted to know if he could file for insurance for the merchandise of his friend, which was not covered with the insurance. After a long debate, the rabbi who answered his question, in this case in the book Sha'ar Ezra by Rabbi Ezra Basri, said that the owner of the warehouse should inquire with other insurance companies, whether they would cover such an event or not. Most probably, the man should ask with his own insurance company, and that is because the laws of liability here are not dictated by the Torah, but what is the consensus. So if the consensus between and the norm between the insured, in this case the owner of the warehouse, and the insurance company is that the policy only covers merchandise that belongs to the owner of the warehouse, he cannot include in this damage the goods that belonged to a friend. The rules of the Torah in this case, in all other cases of contracts and agreements, and as they are later on elaborate on in the Talmud, apply mainly when there is no written or accepted law in the place. Following the laws of the Shomrim, of the guardians, we find sort of a miscellaneous list of halachot. If a man entices a girl who's not married yet and sleeps with her, he must marry her. And if her father refuses to let her marry him, he will have to pay as if he's paying for a wedding. This halakha is to protect the dignity and integrity of the woman, and it's not to say that a man can rape or violate a woman and then decide to marry her, as we found in the book of Bereshit regarding Shechem. The following halakha is v'chashefa lo tehayeh, you shall not let a witch live. This is an important, those three important words to try to understand and analyze in the context of the society and history, especially since in modern time or medieval times, they served as a basis for the famous or infamous witch hunt. And the question is, when the Torah says you shall not let a witch live, what is exactly that witch that the Torah refers to? Since we accept the words of Maimonides, who says, accept the truth, no matter who the author of that truth is, that means that we are bound by scientific process and analysis, and we must accept scientific results. So since science today has proven beyond doubt that witchcraft is not a valid thing, then we must assume also that God, who gave the Torah, knows as well that there is no such thing as witchcraft, and it has no practical effect. It's only maybe in people's imagination that they believe the prophecies or promises or curses of a witch or a wizard anyone who is engaged in this kind of activities. So why would the Torah say "Mechashefa lo tehayeh"? I think that the answer is, and this is something that people should try to analyze and consider. I'm not giving it as the only possible interpretation. Is the Torah does not say "Mechashefa motumat," that Mechashefa should be put to death. The regular formula for the death penalty is mot yumat, will be put to death. Here it says Mechashefa lo tehayeh, and it could be understood that what the Torah is saying is, do not let a witch live in your country, meaning anyone who engages in this type of activity should be driven out of the country because it's a pagan, superstitious practice, and not because it has any validity to it. I think that this could also be corroborated by the fact that King Saul eradicated from the land all witches and wizards, I would say. But then, a day before the final battle, went to consult the Ba'alat of Endor. And it would only make sense if the prohibition of the Torah is not to really apply the death penalty to those who are accused of witchcraft, but just to drive them out of the territory. The following halachot have to do with paganism and promiscuity or amoral sexual activity. This is bestiality, very rare. One should not bring sacrifice to other gods, which is part of idolatry. And here comes one of the most important passages in the parasha of Mishpatim. You shall not cause distress or suffering to the sojourner, to the ger, which in itself is a concept that has to be understood. We use the word ger today to describe a convert. In the time of the Torah, it seems to mean that there were different levels of citizenship in the land of Israel, depending on the level of observance or commitment that one had. But society seemed to have been inclusive and accepting people of different levels of observance, and one of them is the ger. In this case, in this context, could be understood as a foreigner, someone who might be practicing the same religion as us, but is not from the same ethnicity, comes from a different land. The Torah says you're not allowed to oppress or cause that person any suffering. Why? You are sojourners in the land of Egypt. And that goes back to the crucial role that Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, plays, not only in our history, but also in our understanding of halakha. As I mentioned regarding Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant between the pieces of Avraham, being told that his descendants will be enslaved for 400 years, Avraham does not respond, not because he does not care, but because God explains to him that this is a necessary process. The only way that the Israelites and later on the Jews would have been able to internalize the idea that slavery is repugnant and should be abolished, and that one should be a free person enslaved to God alone. And since one is created in the image of God, that gives one tremendous freedom. And only by going through the slavery in Egypt, the Torah could tell us, you shall not oppress the sojourner because you know what it is, what it means to be a sojourner. The Torah also says here, you should not cause suffering to a widow or an orphan, because then when they turn out to me, I will be the judge. I will be the one who protects them. It is very interesting to see when we look at retrospect in the whole parasha, what seems to be inconsistency in the way the halachot are put together, and this has already been pointed out by commentators, mainly by Rabbi Yitzhak Abarbanel. But I think that one of the reasons the Torah sort of jumps or skips from one topic to another, something that we will see again in Parashat Kedoshim, is deliberate, is to show that we are dealing with a whole system. One cannot pick and choose to do only the rituals that have to do with sacrifices, with the temple. as people do today, the synagogue and kashrut, but neglect other parts, which are the ben adam l'haviro, taking care of other people and their necessities, and especially of the weaker layers of society. From that point on, the Torah goes to list different halachot of different categories, the issue of charging interest, the prohibition of keeping a collateral in a situation where the person needs that object, not turning against leadership. It is not to say that a leader is impeccable or infallible, but the wording of Elohim lo tekalel v'nasi ba'amicha lo ta'or, it seems the Torah has an objection to the idea of cursing, because cursing is attacking someone in a negative way and does not bring about any productive result. One has to respect the leadership, but this is not to say that one is not allowed to criticize the leaders, as we see later on in Torah, and we see that definitely in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, that the prophets would criticize the leaders of the nation when they did not do the right thing. This does not give them complete immunity. Those are the obligations that one has towards God. So again, this whole parasha shows us that one cannot separate the laws that govern the behavior of one towards God and the laws that govern the behavior of one towards other people, and definitely also the laws of society and government. The following halachot have to do with the judicial system, not to support a wicked man in being a false witness, not to follow the majority when we know that the majority is distorted. This is in the case of court. And even that, vedal lo tehda berivo, not to give a special treatment to a poor person just because he's poor, but rather to try to produce a just verdict. So if we combine that, this is the idea of tzedakah mishpat in the Torah, that on one hand we strive to do the right thing and to judge correctly and justly, but on the other hand, if the poor needs support, of course they need support, then this is the obligation of the Bedin and of society to help them. This is done in the way of giving 10%, as the Torah says in the following halachot: the law of Shemitah, where the 7th year is giving to everyone. Everyone is free access to the fields. The Ma'asor, the 10% that are given to people. So, in conclusion, we could look at the Parashat Mishpatim as a parasha that is really an anthology of laws of many different categories that teaches us that we are responsible for our actions and we're responsible towards other people. It also drives home the idea of Tzelem Elokim, of the image of God, since the slaves and the maidservants are elevated to a level that at that time was unprecedented in any other culture, and one might say even in more modern culture, this is something that we do not find. Following Parashat Mishpatim, we come into a very intriguing description of the building of the tabernacle, starting in chapter 25 of the book of Shemot, and going first through chapter 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, up until the story of the golden calf. The Torah dedicates 6 chapters to the building of the Mishkan. Exact description of how the Mishkan is built, the measurement, etc. Then we find the story of the golden calf and the negotiation of Moshe with God, which I'm going to go back into after we discuss the question of why so much text is dedicated to the Mishkan. Following the story of the golden calf, we find another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters from 35 to 40 that deal with the actual construction of the Mishkan. So we have 5 chapters that describe the commandment and the process of creating the Mishkan, and then 5 chapters that describe the actual making of the Mishkan and its final production. 10 chapters dedicated to a temporary mitzvah, something that if it was done only in the desert for the duration of the 40 years that the Israelites traveled in the desert. Even if when they carried on the Mishkan for the first couple of 100 years when they entered Eretz Israel, what is the point of telling us with such detail the construction of the Mishkan, where we do not have the ability nor the necessity to replicate such tabernacle? I mean, later on we'll have the temple, and then the second temple, and then we have the description of the third temple. Each one of them is a little different than the previous. What is the point of telling us the story of the Mishkan with such detail? So, as I mentioned in the previous session, this is my theory, a theory that I came to because of I would say my observation and experience with people who fall into the trap of religious OCD, and that is a problem that really plagues the Orthodox world today, but was also rampant in the past. There are people whose religious behavior turns into an obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, and I'll explain how it is related to the Mishkan. So, OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, when is taken to an extreme, could really debilitate and even completely paralyze a person. Meaning, people who have it in extreme forms are unable to leave the house because they will constantly go back to check whether the house is locked or not, whether they left the kettle on, the gas. They will check a million times and will never be able to get out of the house. The same phenomenon exists in the religious world, but it's very particular. Meaning, one could be completely careless and not paying attention on in any other field of his daily life, but whatever has to do with religion will be very, very meticulous and indeed obsessive. I read a description of one of the great rabbis of a famous dynasty, the Soloveitchik dynasty, that I think it was the Greece of Yitzhak Zev, that had this kind of behavior and whatever had to do with mitzvot. He was always concerned that maybe he did not do the mitzvah correctly, and then he would do it again and again and again. And as I read these lines, I was thinking of OCD, and as if the author of the book already foresaw what I was going to think, he said, do not mix this type of behavior with OCD, because in all other aspects of his life, Rabbi Soloveitchik was very, very casual. He didn't care about details. It was only in the religious field that he felt like that. However, this is not a good excuse, because there is a phenomenon called scrupulosity, where a person is scrupulous or very, very meticulous only in issues that have to do with the religion. And this could really, just like regular OCD, could debilitate or even paralyze a person in his daily life. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I published an article on that, and back then there was some backlash because I think the concept was not yet acknowledged in the religious world. But if you go today, if you search the term religious OCD, you'll find that many Orthodox websites offer counseling on the issue. At the time when I wrote the article, I got an email from one of my readers who lived in Israel, Dr. Rabbi Avigdor Bonchek, who was working on a book on the matter. And when the book was published, by Feldheim, he described cases that I was familiar with some of people who repeat the tefillah endlessly, or who would wash their hands 100 times for netilat yadayim or for whatever it is. So this is a condition that is well known and documented, and I have the feeling that the Torah, and if we look at all the halachot of the Torah, we will see that all the halachot that are related to the mikdash are described with very fine details, from the construction of them, from the commandment of how to build the Mishkan, and then the actual process of building the Mishkan, and then later on in in Sefer Vayikra, the description of the korbanot, the sacrifices. Everything is quantified, the exact measurements, the exact sizes, the ages of the animals, etc., etc. In my opinion, this was given to people as their doses of OCD behavior. And this is a crucial point to understanding the Halakhic mindset of the Bible, of the Tanakh. Since in the time of the Tanakh, the focus of religious activity was completely different was totally different than the way it is today. Most people who are asked today, where is the focal point? What is the focal point of religious activity? Will say that it is the synagogue. How often do you go to the synagogue? Which synagogue do you choose to go to? How long do you stay in the synagogue, etc., etc. They will add also some types of a religious ritual. How big are the tefillin? How expensive are they? Do you have one or two? How big is the tzitzit? Do you have techelet? Many details that surround ritual. But in the time of the Torah, the balance was completely different. The focus of, or the focal point of ritual was the temple, but the temple was in only one place, because the Torah eradicated or fought to eradicate the local altars and pagan services, even though it was not very successful. In every couple of years or generations, there has to be a thorough cleansing. But the Torah wanted to create a central place of worship, which is Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. Or, before it was Jerusalem, whatever place that was chosen. And only a small group of people, the Kohanim, would be in the temple performing services representing the whole nation. And they would take turns in performing those services. The rest of the people would be in their homes, in their fields, working regularly, and visiting the temple only 3 or 4 times a year. 3 times in the pilgrimage holidays, and sometimes in additional times for personal reasons. But most of the time, the religious life of an Israelite in the time of the first temple and of the Tanakh revolved around his house and field, and that is where he had to perform most of the mitzvot. It was about eating, the way of eating, and what you're allowed to eat. It was about the way you cultivate the field, which animals you use, how you do grafting or other activities in the field, ceasing from working on Shabbat, etc. All these things made the religious life of an Israelite focused on his daily routine, and there was no need for rituals, and there was no need for OCD, because things were done in a normal, not casual way, but a way where one had habit and knew how to go along with what he has to do. So the Torah, in a sense, gave people this space or place where they could use and display their need for obsessive compulsive behavior. When they go to the temple, everything is clear and detailed and regulated. And when they go home, the halacha is more, or the practice is more fluid, more flexible, is how it had to be. And I think that we can see it today also when you look at the type of halachot that people learn. Most people invest their time in learning Shulchan Aruch Or Haim, which deals with the halachot of tefillah, of brachot, Shabbat, etc. And perhaps people learn less details of Shabbat, but there is a tremendous attention to details in tefillot and brachot, which are all rituals. And the amount of literature written around this topic of how exactly to say the bracha, when to say it, what is the right version, when this is all rabbinical, there is not one blessing that is the right except for Birkat Hamazon, and even that, when you look at the pshat of the pasuk, suggests that it is a blessing. Tanakh means when you come to the land, you will eat and you'll be satisfied to the extent that you will want to offer God a blessing. But even if we take that as this is the bracha midoraita, all the rest is midirabanan, all the rest is rabbinical. Same with prayers. Prayers are, even according to Maimonides, who says that the prayers are biblical, the commandment is to pray once a day in any language that one understands any time of the day. So let's say if a person went through the day and said once, inshallah, or God willing, may God help me, please God help me, whatever that he or she said, this counts as tefillah. But that's only according to Maimonides. According to Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, there's not even an obligation, a biblical obligation to pray. It's all rabbinical. So we have hundreds or thousands of volumes written about the proper way to pray, but we don't see the same obsession with the daily routine of going to work, business ethics, etc. So we definitely miss here the point of the Torah. That is my interpretation. That's why I think the Torah gave so much room, so much space to the laws of the Mishkan and all these regulations later on that have to do with the temple. We go back now to chapter 32, 33 in Shemot, where we read the story of the golden calf. And here I want to look at one discussion between Moshe and God when Moshe negotiates the pardon, the forgiveness for Am Yisrael, and he says the following. This is in chapter 32, verses 12, just verse 12. למה יאמרו מצרים לאמור ברעה הוציאם להרוג אותם בהרים ולכלותם מעל פני האדמה שוב מחרון אפיך וינחם על הרעה לעמך. Moshe tells God that it is not the right thing to annihilate the Israelites, because then the Egyptians will say that God's intention when He took Bnei Israel out of Egypt was malevolent. It was evil, and God was intended from the beginning to kill them in the mountains and to annihilate them from above the face of the earth. And for that reason, Moshe asked Hashem to forgive Bnei Israel. And that looks on its face, a very trivial and inappropriate reason for Moshe to present to God, because God is not one to be thwarted by what will people say. We even teach our children and try ourselves not to be affected by peer pressure or by what will people say, and do the right thing. So if God thinks the right thing is to annihilate the Jewish people, the Israelites, and Moshe comes and says, no, it would not look well in the eyes of the Egyptian, this is really strange. So I think that the answer to that question, like what is Moshe saying, is along the lines of what we saw before when Hashem chooses Abraham as the leader of the new nation, with the argument כי ידעתיו למען אשר יצווה את בניו ואת ביתו אחריו ושמרו דרך אדוני לעשות צדקה ומשפט. Abraham was chosen because he is the educator who would lead his children and his future descendants to do mitzvot and to follow the path of Hashem. So that is the initial goal, but the ultimate goal is that knowledge and that behavior will spread to the whole world. And this is again expressed in the word of God to Moshe before Matan Torah, before the giving of the law of Har Sinai. Ve'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim vegoy kadosh. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And since the role of the priest is to teach and educate, if the Israelites become a kingdom of priests, and they are the educators of the world. In the same vein, Moshe now argues with God. He says, the whole intention of Bnei Israel experiencing and living through slavery is that they will be able to feel the idea of what freedom is, what Shabbat is, what the image of God is, and eventually influence the whole world. If you now destroy the Jewish people, the Israelites, you are destroying the whole possibility of other people learning from their ways. Or in other words, it's still a negotiation with God. It's still somewhat weird, but it's not about how will you look in the eyes of the nation, but rather for the final purpose, for the ultimate goal of Az efuch al-amim safa be'ura likro kulam b'shem Hashem. Then all nations will follow the ways of God. This act of annihilating the Jewish people or the Israelites will set everything back, maybe in a way which is irreversible. And God accepts Moshe's argument and forgives the Israelites in that at that moment. So that is one way to see it. Again, what we're attempting to do here is to find a consistent ideology in the Tanakh, and to analyze even dialogues like that within that general goal and ideology of the Tanakh. There is one more thing that I would like to highlight in the book of Shemot, in the story of the construction of the Mishkan, and that is the story of Mar'ot HaTzoveot, the mirrors of the women who gathered around the temple, around the Mishkan. This is described in one enigmatic verse, chapter 38, verse 8. It says this: Vayas et hakiyor nehoshet ואת קנו נחושת במראות הצובעות אשר צבעו פתח אוהל מועד. He made the basin for washing feet and hands, and the basis for the basin from copper. And the copper was taken from the mirrors of the women who gathered around the tabernacle. As I said, the pasuk is enigmatic. The Midrash interprets that as the mirrors of the women who came to give them as a donation to the temple, and those mirrors reflect the redemption of Bnei Israel from Egypt. According to the Midrash, when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and at a certain point thought that they should not continue having children and have families, their wives would go to the field, and they would use the mirrors to beautify themselves, to look good, and then they would go to the field and arouse their husbands and sleep with them and have children. I mean, the whole Midrash itself is a famous Midrash. Is pretty complicated to understand how this is possible technically for those slaves and their spouses who supposedly come all dressed up and elegant to the field, to where they are engaged in hard labor and have intimate relationship with them there in the open. But putting that aside, the best way to understand the Tanakh is through the Tanakh itself, and we actually have a clue to what is Mar'ot HaTzoveot, and that is in the book of Shemuel, when the author describes the evil actions of the sons of Eli, the high priest Eli. The Navi says in the first book of Shemuel, chapter 2, verse 22, says the following: ועלי זקן מאוד ושמע את כל אשר יעשון בניו לכל ישראל ואת אשר ישכבון את הנשים הצובעות פתח אוהל מועד. Ali was very old, he could not control his children, and his two sons, he heard what they did, all the evil things, including sleeping with the women who were gathered at the opening of the tabernacle, the gate of the tabernacle. So here again, the Midrash or the rabbinic literature had a problem with the text. It's how we say, it's a difficult pasuk verse to swallow, to think that the Kohanim, the sons of Eli, would sleep with women at the entrance of Ohel Moed, and therefore the Midrash says that they did not sleep with them, but rather they would. Those were women who gave birth and came to give their to bring their sacrifice, as one is commanded to do after giving birth. But the sons of Eli delayed them next to the temple and did not let them to go back home. And the Midrash explains that because they prevented them from going back to their husbands, it was as if they slept with them. This obviously is not what the text says. And indeed, the commentators who follow the Pshat, and among them Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra, say that they actually slept with the women who were there at Petah Ohel Moed. So now we have in the book of Shmuel a reference to Nash'at Soveot, women who are gathered around Ohel Moed, and in the book of Shemot, the mirrors of the men who are gathered around Ohel Moed. Those two come together to tell us a different story, and that is that in the time of the first temple, in the time of the Tanakh, the phenomenon of what is called sacred prostitution was rampant in Israel. It was very common among other nations. It was later on brought back to Israel at the time of the second temple by the Greeks, who built special rooms for those women and men who practiced the sacred prostitution in the temple. And this is really what our tradition refers to when they said Tim'u kol hashmanim, that they profaned or they rendered impure all the oils and all the sections of the temple. And this is described in detail in Megillat Ta'anit and other sources of the period. But that is during the second temple. During the first temple, we know that it was a practice among other cultures, but it was also a practice that existed in the temple in Jerusalem. The proof for that can be found in the book of Melachim, the second book of Melachim, in chapter 23, when we read about the thorough cleansing and revolution that King Yoshia performed in the temple. When King Yoshiyahu, he found out that he's not allowed to engage in idolatry. Surprise! I mean, for some reason, this was totally forgotten. And as we were renovating the temple, they found a sefer. Some say it was Sefer Devarim. Some say it was the whole Torah. They read it and they find out that what they do, which is idolatry and pagan worship in the temple, is forbidden. And King Yoshiyahu orders a thorough cleansing of all pagan items and types of service and worship that could be found in the temple. We read about Hasusim asher natu malchei Yehuda lashemesh, horses which were dedicated to the sun worship, the tofet, the furnace where people would bring their children as human sacrifices. Mizbahot asher al agag, there were altars on the roof. There were altars in front of Yerushalayim, built for the idols Ashtoret or Astarte, the goddess of the Phoenicians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom of the Ammonites. And the king broke the monuments. He chopped down the trees that were used for pagan services. Unbelievable detail to think that in the time of King Yoshiyahu, shortly before the destruction, about 100 to 200 years before the destruction, we find such pervasive paganism in the temple. But one of the interesting items that is mentioned here is in chapter 23 of 2 Kings, of the second book of Kings, in verse 7. ויתוץ את בתי הקדשים אשר בבית אדוני, אשר אנשים הורגות שם בתים לעשירה. He destroyed the house of the prostitutes that existed inside the temple, meaning within the temple there were either rooms or special areas for kedeshim. Kedeshim is the plural of kadesh, which means a male prostitute. Could include in that context women prostitutes as well, but this was something that was practiced in the temple. So that takes us back to the book of Shemuel, where we find the children of Eli, as I mentioned before in the first book of Shemuel, chapter 2, verse 22. אשר ישכבון את הנשים הצובעות פתח אוהל מועד. They literally sleep with the women who are surrounding Oel Moed, because they brought back this pagan worship, this sacred prostitution to the temple, to the tabernacle. Now we go back to the book of Shemot, where we found in chapter 38, verse 8, that Moshe made the basin and its base from copper that was taken from the mirrors of the women who gathered around Oel Moed. Since they are called tzoveot, it's a direct correlation with the story of the women in Shemuel, and that means that once the tabernacle was built, women who were aware of the pagan practice thought they were going to practice that at the entrance of the new tabernacle. Moshe maybe scolded them, maybe rebuked them, but what is clear, he confiscated the mirrors, but instead of punishing the women, or instead of throwing the mirrors away, he converted them into something holy. And that, I think, we'll talk about it later as we go through the books of Hosea, which also deal with this phenomenon. And even when we talk about the laws of marriage and divorce, we'll see that this is part of the general ideology of Torah, of instead of the pagan way of life, where there were the practical life at home and then life of desire and pleasure at the temple, the Torah said that the temple will be a dedicated place which will be visited infrequently, maybe 3 times a year, whereas all the other activity, the sacred and the mundane, will be conducted at home. And in that way, even the mundane will be elevated to a level of the sacred. So in that sense, the marriage is considered a holy union between a man and a woman. And the Torah wants people to invest their marriage and their relationship with love and mutual respect, and not to divide it in a way that marriage is just a practical thing to create a family and to have children, and then one, as in the time of the temple, would go to the temple to seek pleasure or release. And in today's society, people look for side affairs because they cannot find satisfaction in their marriage. So the Torah wants to combine both and to elevate the what would be the daily routine or the daily grind, where people don't have time to pay attention to each other, to a holier level, by eliminating the possibility of doing that in the temple. And the symbolic act of Moshe of taking the mirrors, which was used for that promiscuous activity in the temple, and turning them into the basin which was used to purify the hands and feet of the Kohanim entering the temple, is perfect in that role, symbolizing that you take the mundane and you elevate it to a holy level. Moshe did this again after the dispute of Korah and his followers, when the 250 men brought the incense and their sacrifices was rejected, and they were burnt, the Torah says that Moshe took et mahtot hataim ele benafshotam, the pens that were used by those sinners. This is in chapter 17, verses 1 to 5. את מחטות החטאים האלה בנפשותם ועשו אותם ריקועי פחים ציפוי למזבח כקריבום לפני אדוני ויקדשו ויהיו לאות לבני ישראל. Hashem commands Moshe to take the pans, meld them and turn them into a coating for the altar, for the mizbeah. Again, it's like from one end to another. The pans that symbolize the rebellion against God are now molten and attached to the altar to show the exact opposite, which is loyalty towards God. And if you're already in the book of Bamidbar, I mentioned one more incident that proves that this kind of sacred prostitution or promiscuity at the temple was rampant. And just like the women in the book of Shemot were trying to reinstitute that tradition, it was done again in the book of Bamidbar. This is in chapter 25, the famous story of Phinehas, and the Midianite woman that we read in verse 6 of chapter 25. והנה איש מבני ישראל בא ויקרב אל חוות המדיינית לעיני משה ולעיני כל עדת בני ישראל והם הבוכים פתח אוהל מועד. The Israelite man came and he brought the woman, the Midianite woman, in front of Moshe and in front of all Israelites, and they were crying at the gate of Oel Moed. Again, it's the same place. It's Petach Oel Moed. It's at the entrance. It's usually where sacred prostitution is performed, and that's why the choice of word is very, very particular. Vayakrev elehav. He brought closer, but also he sacrificed to show that what he's doing is a sacred act, and of course is killed in the process by Pinchas, because Pinchas wants to show that this kind of pagan worship is not to be performed in front of the temple. That is also interesting because usually this story is interpreted as a punishment for the Israelite for sleeping with a non-Jewish woman, but this prohibition does not appear anywhere in the Torah. And the rabbis had to to conclude that Habu'el Aramit Kana'im Pogimbo, that if one would ask in the rabbinical court what is the punishment of one who committed that crime, he will not receive an answer, and only the zealot is allowed to take the law into his hands and punish that man, but that the zealot will also stand scrutiny to make sure that his actions were really done L'Shem Shamayim. This is another discussion that will have to be dealt with in the future. However, this will be for today the last item that we analyze, and that is that the all these details scattered around the Tanakh, the Marot HaTzovot in Shemot, the story of Pinchas in Bamidbar, and the story of the women in Shemuel, and the cleansing of the temple in Melachim Bet, they all together show us that there was this phenomenon that is we could call either sacred prostitution or promiscuity at the temple that afflicted the temple in Yerushalayim, and probably is at the background of certain halachot that we're not even aware of. So that will be all for today, and hopefully when we continue, we will already be in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus.